Now we have our second talk about Samba. Kieran is going to talk to us about some dirty Samba hacks.
Hello LCA, my name's Kieran. Thanks for the claps. And I'm obviously going to talk about some dirty Samba hacks to make your life easier. First of all, these are my opinions, obviously, not my employers, and all that jazz. And they're dirty hacks. It's not well-engineered, elegant stuff. It's, pretty dirty, but that's all right. That's what we're here for. And I'm a sysadmin, not a software engineer. And just a quick show of hands, who would consider themselves a sysadmin? Okay, yeah, cool. So, as most of you will be aware, sysadmins, we tend to use tools, not necessarily in the way they were designed. People like Andrew might cringe at what we're doing here, but we get the job done, and that's the important thing. So I'm going to do tools for password management, some easier remote access stuff, group and user management, and some user synchronization. I'll just mention as well, source code for each of these things will be in that green bar at the top of each page. So first of all, why would I want to notify users that their password is going to expire? In our environment, we have a number of clients and partners that don't necessarily have a domain-connected PC. And as anybody who's been forced to use Windows would know, bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you get a little pop-up warning you, hey, your password is going to expire, blah, blah, blah. But for people who do need access to our resources and don't have a domain-connected PC, particularly for stuff where they need to access Redmine or Jira or one of these other services that uses Active Directory for authentication. So yeah, that's the reason why we need to advise people that their password is going to expire. So how are we going to do it? So we need to find out when the user's, how old the user's password is, how old we allow passwords to be on the domain, and a few other things like whether or not the account is disabled, because obviously we don't want to email people who don't care. So for some of that information, you'll get it through PDB-Edit or LDAP search. PDB-Edit, for those who don't know, is a Samba tool that allows you to edit the database, but it also lets you just dump a list of all the users and information about them. It is a lot slower than LDAP search. LDAP search is more than twice as quick as PDB-Edit for getting kind of information I want. LDAP search is also better in that it can perform more complex queries. You tend to just get a dump of things with PDB-Edit. But you can query the database without a password with PDB-Edit, assuming you're running as root on your domain controller. So if you're creating a script that you're going to be putting in source control, you don't have to worry about extracting passwords before you upload it and then making sure you've got the passwords in the script once you download it. Obviously, for somebody who's not creating a dirty hack, you'd be like, oh, well, that's an external thing that you pass to your script as you're running it, but as I said, dirty hacks. So that's why I've used PDB-Edit in some of these scripts. And also the other reason is you can grep PDB-Edit really easily, and hey, I'm a sysadmin, I like to grep things. So now that we've told people that their password's going to expire and they don't have a domain-connected PC, how are we going to get them to change their password? Well, there's a few ways of going about this. The most normal way, I guess, people would do this is you'd have a Windows terminal server that people remote into and use that to change the password. But as many of you are probably aware, Microsoft charge an arm and a leg just to be allowed to log on to a precious Windows server. And of course, it's yet another Windows server in your environment, which nobody wants that. We want something web-based as well. It also doesn't have the complexities of having to RDP anyway, because a lot of these people who are partners and clients, they might be bringing skills that are not technical skills, so having to train them on how to use something like Microsoft Terminal Services client is an unnecessary distraction. And if you can send them a URL and an email, that's great. We want something that's secure, and we want to avoid poorly limited closed source solutions because there are a number of them out there. Obviously, what we're trying to do here is not new. There's a number of solutions, enterprise solutions out there in the wider world that you can purchase to get this functionality. But from my research, a lot of them are pretty flaky. If the trials I installed, that you either need to have IIS installed on a Windows server, and once again, that's another Windows server. You don't want to have to manage your environment. You have to keep it patched. You have to worry about it. And if they don't use IIS, they use their own homegrown crypto weirdo thing that's running their own HTTPS server, last updated in 2001, and it's like, don't really want that, especially when we're passing passwords through that server. So I thought, okay, well, what are we going to do as a solution here that isn't going to cost us exorbitant amounts of money and is going to be at least reasonably secure, great, up-to-date language that everybody wants to use these days? PHP. Now, I did say dirty hacks. Now, mostly I picked PHP because I may have been one of those teenagers in the 90s who created a lot of dodgy web pages with PHP, and I know it. But I'm not in the 90s anymore, and I'm not a teenager, and this is real stuff in production, and we have to worry about security. So I did some research, and I determined that we're going to have to we're going to have to do a better job than that. So how can I do this somewhat sanely? We start with a domain-connected virtual machine, obviously running Linux. And when I say domain-connected, obviously it's running Samba and has joined the domain as a workstation, I guess you'd say. We're running Apache on that, which is serving up this website, which, as I said, is running PHP. That's okay, because so we take the input from PHP, and then we send it directly onto the command line, because nobody can see a problem with that at all. If you haven't seen that before, that's just a simple, it comes with Samba, it's a tool for resetting your password. There are problems with this, clearly. So, this works, but we need to fix it. So, first of all, input validation. So, we narrow the scope of what PHP is allowed to send down into the command line. Obviously, not many hyphens and spaces and escape characters, but it's still not perfect. I'm sure I haven't created the most perfect 100% input validation in the world. B, even if I have, PHP may have a history of certain vulnerabilities and issues. So let's assume that let's assume the input validation's failed and people are passing stuff we don't want down the command line. So the first thing we do is run it in rbash. Now, for those of you who don't know, rbash is a restricted version of bash that only allows you to run certain commands that you specify and only access certain folders, things like that. Still not perfect because there's all kinds of ways of escaping out of rbash and getting programs to run other programs, and yeah, it's not perfect, but it's another layer. Then the real meat of it is AppArmor. So we say, for those of you unaware, AppArmor is something similar to SE Linux that allows you to specify much more granularly how you're going to run things. So you can say, this application is running and is allowed to make these system calls and access only these parts of the kernel and that kind of thing. The easiest way to achieve this is actually to run AppArmor in audit mode and just follow the happy path for running your application and just capture what it actually needs and then implement that. And then finally, infrastructure firewall. Obviously not a firewall that's running on the VM, because if the VM's compromised, they can just remove that. But if you've got an infrastructure firewall running around the VM, then even in the worst case scenario, your machine is completely compromised, they can only access the Samba AD server and only on the ports that you specify. So you can't, for instance, use it as a jump box to SSH into somewhere else in your infrastructure. So that's what we've done. It's still PHP, it's still a dirty hack, but we're getting a lot of functionality, a lot of convenience, and we're mitigating very well, I think, the dangers involved here. Also, I will mention, on our domain at least, domain admins have to authenticate with smart cards. So that would, you're not, A, this machine's never going to see a domain admin's password, and B, it wouldn't help even if they did. Right, so let's walk away from the hideousness that is PHP. So, another issue. We have multiple buildings at my organisation. I should mention it as well. I work at Planet Innovation, great place to work, by the way. And we have a great network set up between the buildings. Everything's connected. We have roaming project teams. So most of the work in my workplace is project-based, and people will join or leave projects depending on their skill sets. Maybe a designer comes in for a few days, and then they need a programmer to come in for a different part of it. But people come together to form project teams, and it's better collaboration when you're doing it in person. When you've got all of the desks sitting in roughly the same areas, you can turn around and talk to somebody who's working on the same project with you. It's better for collaboration. But if you've got people spread across multiple floors of multiple buildings and you want to get them together, it's a bit of a pain to get somebody to pack up their workstation and everything on their desk, put it in a trolley and move it down the road if you're only going to be on the project 4 days. Pardon me. So a solution is obviously set up hot desk machines for people to remote into their real machine, just leave their real machine where it is. And the issue with that is some of the users are non-technical, and it's less of an issue that compared to what I was talking about before, where you've got external partners and clients. You can train people how to use RDP and what all of the twiddly knobs mean and what they do and how to use it. And it isn't perfect though, because you can't. Somebody's machine name, for example, might change, or they might just not know it to start with. They might not recognise the fact that they need to know their machine name, and they've already gone and set up their flowers on the desk down the other machine, and they call up and they're like, I need to remote into my machine, and it's like, okay, well, what's your old machine name? And they have to walk down there. It's a pain in the bum. This is a bit of a distraction here, but another option we looked at was having hot desks that have all the applications installed so that somebody would leave their desktop there, not remote into it, but be able to stand up their work environment, because all the files are stored on the network, obviously. But there's problems with applications and licenses there, because if you want to run SolidWorks, for example, which is a CAD-CAM piece of software, A, licensing is an issue if you've got another machine on the network, and B, hardware is an issue. You need to have a decent graphics card, so you don't want that. So as I said before, you want to RDP into your real workstation back wherever that is on campus. So for the reasons I outlined above, we want to simplify that somehow for users. So you've got your workstation and you've got your hot desk machine. And as I said, you just want to RDP into it. You don't know what the machine name is. You're not that familiar with what even RDP is or how to use it. So it's not an ideal solution. So how can we get the hot desk to take only the username and password, and then from there know which user workstation to go to and automatically connect to it? And also, let's use Linux because that's where we are today, and everybody likes Linux. So the user workstation, we know what its IP address is because it had to authenticate to the Samba Active Directory server. We can't really get the hot desk to communicate directly with that to get that information, because how are you going to get the information? If you stand up a web server on that, it's not really a good idea. You don't want to run a web server or anything else that you don't need to run on your Active Directory server. You want it to be purely dedicated to that task. So, and also there's a security risk as well, of course, obviously. So what we do is we use Samba Status to, which is a command line tool, just to dump a list of users and where they're logged in. We create a login list of where everybody is, and then we send that over to another server whose sole purpose is to be a HTTPS server, and then we can pull the information via HTTPS. Now, we do some simple authentication so that there's basically a static password in Apache on this machine so that not everybody can just grab that information of who's logged in where. Now, obviously, it's stored, that password's stored on the hot disk, so if somebody compromised that machine, then yes, they could get access to that, but once again, dirty hacks versus the risk factor versus the convenience. So now that hot disk can RDP directly into that user's workstation. This is what it looks like. It's incredibly simplistic, as you can see. It just asks for this is Compiz without the Unity plugin, which makes for a pretty good kiosk solution. This was created back when 1604, Ubuntu 1604 was a thing. You can't really do anything with this machine. That is actually a terminal window running with obviously no window decorations, and the background color is the same as the background color of the terminal, but nobody needs to know that. It looks like an actual application. And I told you it was dirty hacks. But it works really well. And in fact, we had the input latency and response time on this was better on an old Core 2 Duo machine than a new i7 as far as, so hats off to X3RDP people for doing a really great RDP client. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we have project-based permissions model at work. So we have a more sophisticated model now, but I've provided the script here from our previous model because it's simpler and you guys could probably massage it to your use case a little bit more easily. So there is a project name, and then there's a project _m for the manager of that project. So what we're doing here is we need to tell people who are managing projects who's in their team. Now they can manage that information themselves through a tool. CJW Dev Group Manager. It's a Win32 app. It's shareware. It's not Linux related, but I just want to shout out to that guy because great little tool that allows anybody. It links into Active Directory and makes use of the manager field for a group, so that that manager can log in and easily change permissions on people who are a member of their team. But the problem, so getting access to a project is not really a problem. The problem is removing access, because as I mentioned before, people flow in and out of different projects and in amongst different teams, and they never seem to get removed from a project. And so, as I said, they might have a brief membership, but their permission tends to persist. And that's a problem because we have valuable intellectual property. I know RMS thinks there's no such thing as intellectual property, but it's a useful catch-all phrase. We have valuable intellectual property, which is the main output of our organization. So we want to keep people's permissions as, we only want people to have permission for as long as they need to. And managers aren't going to go back and review the list of who has access to a project, because that just seems like unnecessary work. So what we do is we use this script, we know who the project manager is, and we know who's in the project, and we can send them an email once a month. That seems to be not too much of a nag, to say, hey, the following people have access to your project. Are you sure they should still have access? And yes, I said no post-join of tracking permissions. This is really simple. This is like a 4-liner, but I just put it up here because it is useful, and I couldn't find something easy when I went looking, but just a simple script to notify the help desk when somebody's account's locked out. Same for this. Exporting information from LDAP and getting it in the format you want can be quite painful, especially when you have to conform to a really strict API. So this one's a useful template to take, so you can create, you can make use of groups and assign the correct output structure of users and their details that then gets uploaded to an external API. So this is what we've done. We've notified people of their passwords expired. We've changed passwords via self-service. We have a simple instant hot desk solution so people can get into their workstation machines without having to worry about the intricacies and many twiddly knobs of using RDP from Windows, and also avoided Microsoft tax as much as possible. We've informed project leaders of who has access, notified help desk of locked accounts, and synchronized our directory with external services. And yeah, and I'd just like to, this is the end of my talk, by the way. I just wanted to thank LCA staff for putting on such a great show, and my employer for allowing me to open source all of this and paying for me to be here. Do we have any